My name is Maribel Brown. I am 34 years old. Leave your office keys on the table before you go. My father stood at the head of the dining room table, pointing his finger at the heavy oak doors. He expected me to pack up my laptop, abandon the shipping software empire I built from scratch over 14 grueling years, and hand the chief executive title over to my younger sister. I looked him dead in the eye and said a single word: "All right." Welcome back to Morning Revenge. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled my family toxic empire in exactly 5 days, drop your age in the comments and let me know if your family ever tried to sacrifice your life work for a favored sibling. If you believe in standing your ground, hit subscribe. Now let me take you back to where the trap was set. 10 minutes before that confrontation, the Louisiana humidity clung to the tall glass windows of the Baton Rouge Country Club. The air inside the private dining room smelled of expensive gin, melted butter, and quiet desperation. I sat at the long table watching my mother Vivian trace the rim of her crystal champagne flute. She had maxed out her remaining credit lines to fund this opulent retirement dinner for my father Richard. It was a curated illusion designed to mask the quiet decay of his regional freight business. Richard tapped his silver spoon against his glass. The sharp clink cut through the ambient chatter. He adjusted his tailored lapels, basking in the glow of the room. I expected him to deliver a nostalgic speech about stepping down. Instead, he pivoted, his gaze locked onto me. The warmth drained from his face, leaving behind a cold, transactional stare. "It is time for fresh blood," Richard declared. His voice echoed off the mahogany walls. "Jessica will be stepping in as the new head of Crescent Marine Logistics." My younger sister sat 2 chairs down from me. She swirled a glass of sparkling water, hiding a tight, practiced smile behind the rim. Jessica had spent the last decade bouncing between failed startup ideas, burning through tuition money and seed capital. Meanwhile, I spent 14 years building Crescent Marine from a single server rack into a premier maritime logistics firm. But Richard operated on an outdated patriarchal delusion. Because he wrote a modest seed check when I first incorporated the business, he viewed my tech firm as a subsidiary of his personal legacy. He believed he held the power to anoint a successor, treating my life work as a family heirloom to be passed down to his favorite child. "You have had your turn, Maribel," Vivian chimed in. She reached across the linen tablecloth to pat Jessica on the shoulder. The diamonds on her ring caught the chandelier light. Now it is her future that matters. I sat perfectly still. My hands rested flat against the fabric of my tailored trousers. A different daughter might have thrown her linen napkin or raised her voice to argue the legality of their ambush, but corporate survival relies on detached calculus, not theatrical outrage. The mathematics of their betrayal were already running through my head. Richard extended a weathered hand, pointing toward the exit. "Leave your office keys on the table before you go." The demand hung in the quiet room. The extended family members and dinner guests held their breath, expecting a visceral reaction. They wanted a fight. They expected me to defend my territory. I reached into my blazer pocket. I withdrew the heavy brass keys and set them deliberately next to my untouched dinner plate. The metal clattered softly against the porcelain. I picked up my encrypted laptop, satchel stood from the table, and walked away. The heels of my shoes clicked a steady, unbothered rhythm on the hardwood floor. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of Jessica laughing as she slid into my vacated chair. They believed they had executed a flawless domestic coup. They assumed the keys resting on the tablecloth granted them access to an empire. They did not realize those brass keys only open the decorative glass lobby doors. The company building the patents and the proprietary source code were shielded by a biometric firewall. By forcing me out, they had just initiated their own financial ruin. By tomorrow morning, their bank manager would deliver the first terrifying reality check. The morning sun reflected off the wrought iron balconies of the French Quarter, casting long, angular shadows across the pavement. I did not drive to my downtown New Orleans office. I sat at the granite kitchen island of my private apartment, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee. My encrypted laptop rested open in front of me, displaying a grid of high-definition security feeds from the Crescent Marine Logistics headquarters. I watched the monitors with the detached patience of a predator observing a trap. Right on schedule, a luxury black rideshare vehicle pulled up to the curb outside my building. Jessica stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a pristine white tailored pantsuit and holding a designer leather handbag. She looked like a woman prepared for a glossy magazine photo shoot rather than a chief executive arriving to manage a complex maritime software firm. She clutched the heavy brass keys I had left on the dining table the night before. Her posture radiated an unearned supreme confidence. She believed those jagged pieces of cut metal represented the keys to a kingdom. She walked up to the decorative glass lobby doors. She slid the brass key into the cylinder, turned the lock, and pushed the heavy glass inward. A triumphant smile played across her lips as she crossed the threshold. She strutted past the reception desk, ignoring the confused glances of my senior engineering staff. She did not bother to introduce herself or ask for a facility tour. She headed straight down the main corridor toward the executive suites and the primary server room, expecting the seas to part for her. But Crescent Marine Logistics handles sensitive proprietary routing algorithms for global shipping fleets. We do not secure our intellectual property with archaic brass deadbolts. 2 months prior, I had overseen a sweeping upgrade of the entire facility infrastructure. Jessica reached the reinforced steel door that guarded the executive wing. She grasped the polished metal handle and pushed. The door held firm, unyielding against her weight. A sleek digital panel mounted on the adjacent drywall glowed with a soft blue ambient light. The system required a biometric retinal scan, linked exclusively to my personal physiological profile. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, watching the high-resolution feed. Jessica frowned, her triumphant smile slipping. She dug into her designer handbag and produced a generic plastic keycard, likely swiped from an old hotel stay or a defunct gym membership. She pressed the plastic against the digital reader. The panel instantly flashed a sharp, unforgiving crimson. A harsh error tone chirped through the quiet corridor. She swiped the card a second time, tapping her high heel against the polished concrete floor. The crimson light flashed again. The error tone echoed louder, drawing the attention of several software developers sitting at their workstations. I watched the polished veneer of the newly crowned executive fracture. She grabbed the steel handle with both hands, yanking it backward. The reinforced door did not budge a single millimeter. Her smug arrogance dissolved into humiliated frustration right in front of the employees she intended to rule. Seeing her throw a silent, petulant tantrum on the security monitor transported me back 2 decades. The heat inside Richard's freight warehouse during a July afternoon was suffocating. The stagnant air smelled of diesel exhaust, damp cardboard, and muddy river water. I was 14 years old, sitting on the cracked concrete floor. Sweat stung my eyes and dark grease stained my fingernails. I had spent 6 grueling hours soldering components on the motherboard of his primary dispatch computer, dragging his paralyzed routing system back online. Richard had walked into the warehouse holding a clipboard. I stood up, wiping my hands on my denim jeans, waiting for a nod of approval or a simple acknowledgement of the labor that saved his daily operations. He looked right past me. Jessica had skipped into the garage, wearing a pristine yellow sundress, holding a melting ice cream cone. Richard dropped his clipboard, scooped her up, and patted her head, praising how beautiful she looked. He did not care about the restored computer network. He did not value the intellect and the grit that kept his business functioning. I learned the cold reality of my bloodline on that humid afternoon. My intelligence would never purchase their affection. They preferred a decorative ornament over a structural pillar. That superficiality defined their entire existence. The night before, during the extravagant retirement dinner, Vivian had adjusted the collar of a tweed Chanel jacket that cost thousands of dollars. She paraded around the country club, projecting the aura of untroubled generational wealth. Yet right before the champagne toast, I stood near the service hallway and overheard her whispering frantically into her mobile phone. She was arguing with a customer service representative over a declined transaction and a bank overdraft fee. It was a glaring structural anomaly. You do not bounce routine checks if you possess liquid capital. The opulent country club dinner, the designer clothes, the arrogant demands to hand over my profitable company, all of it, was a fragile theater meant to obscure a severe hidden illiquidity. They were drowning in secret debt, and my software firm was their chosen lifeboat. My mobile phone vibrated against the granite countertop, pulling me back to the present moment. The caller identification displayed Richard. I tapped the screen and accepted the audio connection. I did not offer a polite greeting. "Maribel, what kind of game are you playing?" my father bellowed. His voice carried the booming, growly timbre he used to intimidate dock workers. "Jessica is standing in the hallway, looking like a fool. The door to the executive suite is locked tight. Give me the override codes right now." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid washed over my tongue, grounding my focus. On the monitor, I watched Jessica holding her phone to her ear, pacing furiously back and forth in front of the crimson security panel. "I am not playing a game, Richard," I replied, keeping my tone frigid and precise. "I am maintaining standard corporate security protocols. The executive suite contains proprietary trade secrets. Unauthorized personnel are not permitted inside the server environment." "She is the new chief executive," he shouted, the sound rattling the tiny speaker of my mobile device. "I gave the order last night. You left your keys on the table. The transition is finished. Open that door." I set my coffee mug down, resting my hand flat against the cool granite. "You are confusing a theatrical family dinner with a binding legal transaction," I explained. "Handing over a set of physical brass keys does not equate to transferring corporate equity. I own Crescent Marine Logistics. My name is on the state commercial registry, the patent filings, and the building lease. You cannot assign my assets to your favorite daughter just because you wish it were true." Before he could formulate a response to the undeniable legal reality, I ended the call. I tossed the phone onto the counter and turned my attention back to the encrypted laptop. Stopping Jessica at the physical door was merely a minor tactical blockade. It exposed her sheer incompetence to my staff, but it did not neutralize the true threat. Richard still believed he held leverage over me. He still thought of my tech firm as a disposable extension of his own regional shipping business. For years, his trucks relied on my specialized software to optimize their delivery routes and reduce fuel costs. He assumed that historical connection granted him permanent, unyielding authority over my labor. I opened a new terminal window on my screen and logged into the master administrative database. The physical keys were irrelevant. To make my father understand the true balance of power, I needed to sever the digital artery keeping his empire alive. I prepared to cut his oxygen supply. The cursor blinked on the administrative dashboard. Crescent Marine Logistics was not just a basic routing tool, it was a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence network. The software calculated oceanic weather patterns, port congestion, diesel consumption, and optimal weight distribution for commercial fleets. For 7 years, I had granted my father a complimentary enterprise license. His regional freight company, Gulf Coast Transit, operated on razor-thin margins. Richard despised technology. He viewed laptops as trivial toys and believed physical sweat was the only valid currency of labor. Yet behind his boasting at the country club, my algorithms were the invisible engine keeping his aging fleet of diesel trucks on the road. The logistics industry had evolved rapidly, leaving archaic operators behind. Gulf Coast Transit operated 30 aging diesel trucks. The maintenance costs were astronomical. The only reason Richard secured a recent commercial loan extension was because he presented my software as a proprietary asset during his bank audit. He lied to his creditors, claiming Crescent Marine Logistics was a subsidiary under his control. The bank manager approved the credit line based on that specific technological advantage. Without my software, his dispatchers were blind. The trucks lacked automated gate clearance codes. The fuel optimization charts would vanish, causing his overhead costs to skyrocket. I navigated to the active client registry on my screen. I located the specific authentication token assigned to Gulf Coast Transit. The digital clock in the corner of my monitor ticked toward 10 in the morning. I typed a swift command sequence into the terminal. I did not hesitate or second-guess the morality of the action. Corporate survival requires a cold heart. I highlighted the active license and hit the delete key. The severance was silent but profound. 80 miles away, inside Richard's humid warehouse off the interstate, the large dispatch monitors mounted on the wall flickered. The digital maps displaying real-time truck coordinates vanished into thin air. The complex logistical charts dissolved into a stark blank screen, displaying a simple access denied error code. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, and picturing the chaos unfolding on his dispatch floor. Drivers pulling out of the loading docks would suddenly lose their routing coordinates on their cabin tablets. The warehouse managers would scramble, shuffling through physical paper manifests they had not updated in months. By revoking the license, I did not just stop his trucks. I triggered an automatic breach of covenant on his commercial loans. The bank algorithms would flag the operational halt within hours, the supply chain instantly paralyzed. Richard believed he could forcefully annex my modern tech firm to absorb his failing traditional one, using Jessica as a pliant puppet. He failed to comprehend that I was the structural spine holding both entities together. By cutting the digital cord, I severed his oxygen supply. He was stranded on an island of his own making. The true beauty of the situation lay in a secret I had guarded for 3 years. Richard and Jessica assumed the company was vulnerable to a hostile domestic takeover. They believed that if they somehow bypassed the biometric scanners and gained physical entry to the downtown office, they could seize the servers and claim the empire. They were operating under a catastrophic delusion. 3 years prior, I noticed a dangerous pattern. Vivian began treating my corporate revenue as her personal checking account, demanding exorbitant payouts to fund her country club lifestyle. Richard started co-signing reckless loans for Jessica and her doomed startup ventures. Anticipating my father escalating financial instability, I took proactive legal measures. I remembered sitting across from my estate attorney, a sharp woman who understood the predatory nature of entitled relatives. We spent weeks drafting the clauses. We designed the trust to act as a financial vault. I transferred all intellectual property patents, the proprietary source code, and the deed to the commercial real estate into an irrevocable trust. I named myself the sole trustee. An irrevocable trust cannot be altered, breached, or claimed by creditors or entitled family members. I surrendered personal ownership to protect the structure. I traded vulnerability for invincibility. On paper, Crescent Marine Logistics ceased to exist as an attachable personal asset. Even if Richard battered down the reinforced steel doors of my office, he legally owned nothing. The code, the building, and the client contracts were entirely untouchable. He was fighting a war against a ghost. Jessica could sit in my empty lobby chair all day playing executive. She was ruling over a hollow shell. My phone lit up again. The caller identification displayed the main office number for Gulf Coast Transit. I let it ring 3 times, letting the anticipation stretch before accepting the call. The background noise on the line was a chaotic symphony of ringing landlines and shouting logistics coordinators. The distinct smell of panic seemed to radiate through the cellular connection. I could hear a dispatcher in the background yelling about a spoiled freight load. The chaotic ambient noise was a beautiful symphony of consequences. "Maribel, turn the system back on right now," Richard demanded. His voice was no longer a booming roar. It carried the frantic, ragged edge of a man watching his livelihood drain down a sinkhole. Richard breathed heavily into the receiver. The sound of his labored breathing betrayed his mounting terror. "The trucks cannot leave the yard. We have a perishable contract bound for Houston, and the drivers do not have their gate clearance codes. The commercial credit lines are tied to these deliveries." I kept my breathing steady. I reached for my coffee cup, feeling the smooth ceramic against my palm. "You revoked my position at the retirement dinner, Richard. Crescent Marine Logistics does not provide complimentary enterprise software to unaffiliated third-party vendors. Your free trial expired." "This is not a game," he hissed, desperation bleeding through the phone speaker. "I will drive down to New Orleans right now. I will break down that server room door and take the hardware myself. I built this family. I own that company. You owe me for everything you have." I poured the remaining cold coffee down the kitchen sink, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. "You do not own anything," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "Physical intimidation holds 0 weight against airtight digital ownership. The patents and the servers belong to an irrevocable trust. If you attempt to breach my facility, the private security firm will hold you for the police. You are facing imminent default on your shipping contracts. I suggest you purchase paper maps for your drivers." He fell silent. The realization of his powerlessness finally pierced his traditionalist armor. He was a man who spent his life solving problems by shouting louder than everyone else in the room. Now he was trapped in a digital maze he could not navigate. He hung up the phone. The financial blockade was established. Richard was suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. The bank manager would soon notice the frozen supply chain and freeze his commercial credit. But the war was far from over. My father operated through brute force, while my mother operated through social venom. Unable to breach my digital fortress, Vivian was about to pivot to the only battlefield she commanded. She was preparing to launch a toxic counterattack. The digital blockade held firm throughout the morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the silence from Richard was deafening. He realized his shouting could not penetrate the reinforced walls of an irrevocable trust. But my mother Vivian operated on an entirely separate frequency. If Richard used brute force to solve his problems, Vivian employed a refined social venom. She could not breach my firewall or rewrite my server permissions. Instead, she pivoted to the only battlefield she commanded with ruthless efficiency: the affluent parlors and manicured golf greens of Southern high society. Vivian grew up in a prominent Baton Rouge family that lost its generational wealth but fiercely guarded its pride. She viewed reputation as a tangible currency. To her, perception mattered far more than actual balance sheets. She weaponized her vast country club network before lunchtime. I could easily picture her sitting on the shaded veranda of the club, sipping sweet iced tea and seeding a vicious whispered smear campaign. She likely cornered the wives of local politicians and prominent bank managers, feigning a tearful breakdown. The narrative she spun was calculated and precise. She painted me as an ungrateful, treacherous daughter, intent on bankrupting her elderly father simply to spite her innocent younger sister. According to her manufactured tragedy, I had stolen the family business out of sheer jealousy, locking them out of their own legacy. Word travels fast among idle people with expensive habits. The poison seeped into the local business ecosystem with terrifying speed. The repercussions materialized swiftly. My private inbox flooded with passive emails from extended relatives. Aunts and uncles who had not spoken to me in 5 years suddenly felt compelled to offer unsolicited moral guidance. They sent long, rambling messages about loyalty, the sacred bond of blood, and the duty I owed to my parents. I read a specific note from Uncle Henry suggesting I attend intensive psychological counseling to cure my supposed vindictive streak. I did not reply. I kept my face blank. I dragged every incoming family message directly into the digital trash folder. The ping of the notification chime echoed in my silent kitchen, serving as a hollow reminder of their blind allegiance. The real damage, however, threatened to bleed into my professional sphere. Shortly before noon, my office phone rang. The caller identification showed the number of the Chief Operations Officer for a mid-sized regional distributor based in Shreveport. We were scheduled to finalize a highly lucrative software integration contract the following Monday. I answered the call, expecting a routine technical question. Instead, he spoke in a clipped, hesitant tone, avoiding direct statements. He cleared his throat repeatedly. He mentioned he needed to cancel our upcoming consultation indefinitely. When I pressed him for a logical business reason, he shifted awkwardly on the other end of the line. He cited concerning rumors regarding the structural stability and ethical management of Crescent Marine Logistics. He had played a round of golf that morning with a close friend of Vivian. The social assassination was already disrupting my revenue stream. In standard family dynamics, a daughter might rush to defend her wounded reputation. She might take to social media, penning emotional paragraphs to clarify the truth, or call her mother to beg for a public truce. I refused to engage in a suburban mudslinging contest. I sat back in my leather chair and compartmentalized the noise. Gossip is a depreciating asset. It carries zero intrinsic value and fades the exact moment a new scandal arrives. I understood Vivian was not attacking me out of strength. Her desperate theatrics were a heavy smokescreen designed to mask a much darker reality. Her whispers only confirmed they were terrified of what I might find if I looked closely at their books. Instead of fighting a phantom enemy, I deployed a tactical diversion. I needed them to stop watching my movements while I prepared the final crippling blow. I opened a blank draft in my email client. I composed a brief, polite message addressed directly to Richard. I kept the tone submissive and cooperative, using phrases designed to stroke his fragile ego. I offered to step in and consult during the transition phase. I suggested we could schedule a remote meeting by Friday to discuss unlocking the dispatch servers for a temporary operational grace period. It was a classic red herring. I hit send and waited. I could visualize the immediate celebration unfolding in their sprawling suburban living room. They would read my carefully chosen words and mistake my corporate stall tactic for a pathetic domestic surrender. Richard would puff out his chest, believing his rebellious daughter had finally cracked under the pressure of familial exile. Jessica would probably pour herself another glass of expensive sparkling wine, convinced her mere presence had intimidated me into submission. They would spend the next 2 days arguing over the exact wording of a triumphant, demanding response, outlining their terms of surrender. They swallowed the bait whole. The moment my inbox registered a read receipt from Richard, I locked the door to my private home office and closed the heavy window blinds. The room plunged into a cool, shadowy dimness, illuminated only by the harsh glare of my dual monitors. While they celebrated their imaginary victory, I utilized the distraction to initiate a comprehensive forensic audit on every entity tied to Gulf Coast Transit. My algorithms parsed through a labyrinth of public commercial registries tax filings and obscure state incorporation documents. I built a custom script designed to scrape digital archives, tracing the flow of capital moving in and out of my father-aging freight business. I drank lukewarm tap water and ignored the dull ache forming behind my eyes. The hours bled together. The screen reflected endless lines of raw data illuminating the dark circles forming on my face. I was hunting for the root cause of their hidden illiquidity. I needed to understand why Vivian was bouncing routine checks while wearing designer clothing, and why Richard was so desperate to absorb my pristine tech company right at this specific moment. Numbers never lie. They leave an indelible trail across servers and ledgers, regardless of how much dirt someone tries to shovel over them. As the automated search compiled the scattered financial fragments, a chilling pattern began to emerge from the digital static. I cross-referenced Richard's commercial shipping contracts with his recent bank loan applications retrieved from a public municipal database. The discrepancy was glaring. It was not a simple accounting error or a temporary cash flow issue caused by a slow quarter. It was a structural abyss. I pulled up a digitized copy of the collateral sheet Richard submitted to a major federal lender 3 months prior. He had secured a sweeping multi-million-dollar credit extension to keep his obsolete diesel trucks running and to fund Jessica's endless lifestyle expenses. To qualify for that specific upper-tier commercial loan, he required high-value collateral. He listed the proprietary source code and the registered patents of Crescent Marine Logistics as his own personal attachable assets. He forged my signature on the primary guarantor documents. He did not just attempt to steal my company at a retirement dinner. He had already used my life work to defraud a federally insured financial institution. He committed bank fraud on a colossal scale. By forcing me out and placing Jessica in the executive chair, he intended to quietly cover his tracks, hoping I would walk away feeling defeated before the inevitable state auditors arrived. The society smear campaign was not just petty revenge. Vivian was trying to discredit my character so that when the authorities discovered the forged documents, they would view me as a disgruntled liar seeking vengeance against her own blood. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor. The soft blue light washed over my face, highlighting a cold, steady realization. My pulse steadied into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. This was no longer a simple family dispute over inherited power or hurt feelings. By unearthing those fraudulent loan documents, I had just elevated this conflict to a federal crime. They handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them permanently. I pressed a single key to save the downloaded evidence into an encrypted external drive. The trap was fully loaded. Now I just needed to invite them inside. The encrypted external drive swallowed the initial batch of downloaded evidence, but my intuition insisted the structural rot went much deeper. I sat back in my leather desk chair and rubbed my tired eyes. The digital clock on the bottom right corner of my monitor displayed 2 in the morning. The quiet hum of my workstation cooling fans was the only sound in the dark apartment. I opened a new secure terminal and connected to the Federal Uniform Commercial Code Registry. This public database serves as a financial graveyard, mapping the secured debts and liens of every incorporated entity in the country. If Richard secured a commercial credit extension using my proprietary software as collateral, there had to be a corresponding public record. I initiated a complex Boolean search query, cross-referencing his name with Gulf Coast Transit. The results populated instantly. I scrolled past a dozen routine equipment leases and standard bank lines of credit. Then a distinct entry caught my attention. It was a fresh lien, filed just 72 hours before the orchestrated country club retirement dinner. The lender was not a traditional federally insured bank. It was a private commercial lending syndicate based out of Dallas, Texas. They were notorious within the southern logistics industry. They offered short-term, high-interest bridge loans to desperate companies, providing capital fast and asking very few questions. But a predatory syndicate does not lend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a handshake. They demand bulletproof, attachable collateral. I clicked the hyperlink to view the attached financial schedules, the raw data loaded onto my screen in a dense, monochrome grid. I traced the flow of the borrowed capital, expecting to see the funds routed into the depleted checking account of my father's aging freight business. Instead, the money bypassed Gulf Coast Transit entirely. The transaction ledger showed the funds being wired directly to a holding account managed by a boutique venture capital firm in Austin. My stomach tightened. That specific firm was the primary backer of Jessica's last failed startup venture. 3 years ago, Jessica attempted to launch a luxury subscription box service for high-end pet accessories. She rented a premium office suite, hired a bloated marketing team, and spent exorbitant amounts of money on promotional parties. She played the role of a successful entrepreneur for the cameras while ignoring her actual supply chain. The venture collapsed in less than 9 months, leaving a trail of broken vendor contracts and furious investors. Richard had bailed her out of the immediate legal trouble, but the institutional debt remained hanging over her head. He did not borrow the Texas syndicate money to save his own dying fleet of trucks. He leveraged my life work to erase Jessica's monumental financial failures. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I needed to see the exact structure of the loan. I pulled up the primary incorporation documents filed with the syndicate. A new entity name glared back at me from the bright screen: Crescent Marine Holdings, LLC. I stared at the arrangement of the letters. My legitimate technology firm was registered as Crescent Marine Logistics. Jessica had registered a dummy corporation, intentionally creating a confusingly similar name. It was a classic corporate mirage. The slight variation in the nomenclature was designed to bypass automated underwriting algorithms and trick lazy loan officers into believing they were dealing with my highly profitable company. The sheer audacity of the deception pulled the air from my lungs. I reached for my water glass, but my hand shook slightly, rattling the ice cubes against the crystal. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. I set the glass down and navigated to the final section of the digital file, the promissory note, the legal binding contract that tied the collateral to the borrowed cash. I double-clicked the document, expanding the scanned file to fill my entire monitor. I scrolled down past pages of dense legal jargon, reaching the final signature block. The glare of the screen illuminated the dark room. There, resting clearly beneath the erratic scrawl of my father, name was another signature. It was an exact replication of my own handwriting. The loops and angles of the ink mirrored the way I signed my name. Next to the forged signature was a detailed schedule pledging my commercial real estate, my proprietary routing algorithms, and my active client contracts as the primary collateral for the syndicate loan. I traced the digital ink on the screen with my index finger. The physical reality of the betrayal set in. My sister and my father had stolen my identity. They pledged everything I built over 14 years to satisfy a predatory debt. A signature on a high-value commercial loan requires official authentication. I moved my cursor to the bottom right corner of the document, zooming in on the circular black notary stamp. The raised seal was legible despite the low-resolution scan. The registered notary public was Eleanor Vance. The name sparked an immediate visceral memory. Eleanor was a prominent real estate broker in Baton Rouge, and more importantly, a fixture in Vivian elite country club circle. I vividly remembered Eleanor sipping champagne next to my mother at a charity gala 6 months prior, laughing loudly while adjusting a heavy pearl necklace. The conspiracy snapped into perfect focus. They bypassed standard legal due diligence by utilizing a corrupt, bribed local notary. Vivian weaponized her affluent social network not just to spread vicious gossip, but to authenticate forged financial documents. The entire family was complicit in the scheme. They orchestrated the fraudulent loan to save Jessica from financial ruin, but the syndicate would eventually demand proof of ownership for the pledged collateral. They needed physical control of the assets to maintain the illusion. That was the true motive behind the sudden ambush at the retirement dinner. It was never about a prideful passing of the torch or old-school patriarchal entitlement. It was a desperate, calculated cover-up. They believed that by forcing me out of the company publicly and placing Jessica in the executive chair, they could quietly validate the forged collateral. If Jessica occupied the office and held the title, she could intercept the syndicate auditors and hide their felony. They needed me to walk away in defeat so they could finalize the theft of my empire. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. The cold logic of the situation replaced the initial shock of the betrayal. They assumed I would react like a typical wounded daughter, focused on the emotional damage of the rejection. They did not expect me to run a forensic audit. They committed federal identity theft and documented their crime on public state registries. By orchestrating their flawless domestic coup, they had just handed me a loaded legal weapon. The evidence resting on my hard drive was enough to secure federal indictments for both of my parents and my sister. I closed the federal registry window, leaving only my email client open on the secondary screen. My polite red herring message from earlier in the afternoon sat in the sent folder. Richard had replied with a demanding, arrogant list of conditions for my return to the office. They still believed they were winning the war. They were operating under the delusion that they held the high ground while standing on a trap door I had already unlatched. I did not need to confront them with the forged documents immediately. I needed to let them step further into the snare. I stretched my arms, feeling the tension in my shoulders. The morning sun was beginning to bleed through the edges of the window blinds, turning the dark room a pale shade of gray. The financial severing was already suffocating Richard Regional Freight business. The society smear campaign was a temporary annoyance, but the federal fraud elevated the stakes beyond standard corporate sabotage. Jessica, holding the fake title of chief executive, was about to face the consequences of her unearned position. Believing she had successfully conquered my company and secured the syndicate loan, she was already preparing her next disastrous move. The glow of my primary monitor shifted from a static dashboard to a pulsing alert. It was Wednesday afternoon. A tiny subroutine I had buried deep within the Crescent Marine server architecture triggered a silent alarm. Someone was attempting to transmit a compressed data packet outside our encrypted local network. I set my ceramic mug on the coaster and focused on the rolling lines of code. The origin IP address belonged to the guest internet network at a luxury hotel downtown. The sender was Jessica. She was using a generic commercial email client instead of the secure company portal she could no longer access. She was frantic. Cornered by her mounting personal debts and the suffocating reality of our father-frozen supply chain, she decided to execute a rogue maneuver. She attached a specific data file to her outgoing message. I recognized the nomenclature immediately. 6 weeks prior, I had left a silver thumb drive sitting on my office credenza containing obsolete routing architecture. It was a rudimentary framework from 3 generations ago, lacking the dynamic artificial intelligence integration that made our current system valuable. Jessica had pocketed that drive, believing she secured the crown jewels of my empire. Now she was attempting to sell costume jewelry to professional thieves. I intercepted the transmission protocol and embedded a microscopic tracking pixel into the core directory of her stolen documents. This invisible beacon would ping my server every time the document was opened, scrolled, or copied, sending me real-time geographic coordinates and device diagnostic data. I let the email proceed to its intended destination. The recipient address belonged to the Texas Lending Syndicate. Jessica was pitching them a fraudulent proposal. She offered an exclusive licensing buyout of my proprietary algorithms in exchange for sweeping debt forgiveness. She wanted to trade my life work to erase the financial crater she dug. But as I parsed the metadata attached to her outgoing message, a terrifying plot twist materialized on my screen. The initial draft of her pitch did not originate from her laptop. The underlying keystroke patterns and the document creation history pointed directly to a desktop computer located 80 miles away inside the Gulf Coast Transit warehouse. Jessica was not acting alone. Richard had masterminded this entire desperate pitch. He drafted the proposal, crafted the licensing terms, and instructed his golden child to serve as the face of the transaction. My forensic audit the night before revealed the syndicate loan covered Jessica's startup failures, but the metadata exposed a darker, symbiotic corruption. Richard owed the Texans a fortune from his own failing freight operations long before he bailed her out. He was drowning in toxic liabilities and using his favorite daughter as a sacrificial pawn. He orchestrated the forgery and the dummy corporation to save his own skin, leaving her exposed to the legal fallout. The tracking beacon flashed green. The Texans agreed to a clandestine meeting. 3 hours later, the digital map on my secondary monitor pinpointed the stolen files inside a high-end French Quarter restaurant. The establishment was famous for its archaic dress codes, seared pompano, and dim lighting. It was the perfect venue for wealthy men to conduct unregulated business over expensive bourbon. I sat in my quiet apartment miles away, visualizing the scene. Jessica was likely sitting in a leather booth, wearing another immaculate designer suit, projecting unearned confidence. The men sitting across from her were not provincial country club associates easily swayed by a practiced smile. They were apex predators who specialized in liquidating distressed assets. They demanded collateral they could verify. My screen lit up with a stream of fresh analytics. The syndicate representatives opened the zip file on a portable tablet right there at the dining table. I tracked their precise movements through the embedded pixel. The digital footprint told a story of profound humiliation. The men spent exactly 12 seconds glancing at the polished executive summary Jessica provided. Then they bypassed the marketing jargon and dove straight into the raw back-end logic. The tracking beacon recorded their scrolling speed slowing down as they hit the algorithmic equations. They were probing the architecture, searching for the dynamic variables that handled oceanic weather integration. Those variables did not exist in the outdated framework she provided. I watched the active engagement metrics spike as the Texans began cross-referencing the data. They were asking her technical due diligence questions. The pixel data showed the document rapidly jumping back and forth between basic introductory pages. Jessica was panicking. She was desperately swiping the tablet screen, searching for buzzwords to placate them. She lacked the quantitative literacy to explain a simple linear regression, let alone defend a multivariable logistical matrix. I imagined the sweat forming at her hairline. She was sitting in an air-conditioned luxury restaurant, but the atmosphere was undoubtedly suffocating. She could not articulate how the software calculated fuel consumption or port congestion because she never spent a single night staring at a compiler. She spent her youth learning how to extract praise from our father, while I learned how to build resilient systems. That foundational deficit was now on full display in front of ruthless creditors. By transmitting those files to a Dallas-based server and pitching the fraudulent licensing deal to out-of-state investors, Jessica crossed a fatal threshold. She weaponized the internet to sell intellectual property she did not legally own. The initial forgery was a severe state-level crime, but this clandestine meeting firmly established her direct complicity in federal wire fraud and the illegal trafficking of corporate assets across state lines. The burden of guilt was no longer theoretical. It was codified in the transmission logs resting safely on my encrypted hard drive. The analytics dashboard indicated the file was finally closed. The meeting concluded. Despite the glaring technical holes in her presentation, the syndicate did not walk away. The men from Texas operated in the shadows of the financial sector. They recognized a desperate amateur when they saw one. They knew the code she presented was flawed, but they also knew the true Crescent Marine logistics software was highly profitable. They smelled blood in the water. They were willing to overlook her staggering incompetence because her desperation gave them leverage. They agreed to review the proposal further, demanding a secondary meeting at the downtown office to inspect the physical servers. They wanted to verify her claim to the throne. Jessica had survived the lunch. She likely walked out onto the humid cobblestone streets of the French Quarter believing she had successfully negotiated a lifeline. She thought she manipulated the syndicate. She failed to realize they were simply securing their grip around her neck. The syndicate was about to bite, setting the ultimate trap. They would demand full access to the proprietary vault. Jessica promised them an empire she could not unlock. When she failed to produce the functional source code, the Texans would not respond with passive emails or country club gossip. They would demand their collateral through brute force. And while she prepared to lead dangerous men to an impenetrable digital fortress, I was already drafting the legal mechanism that would ensure she took the fall alone. The French Quarter meeting concluded with handshakes and a profound underestimation of the stakes. The men from Dallas were seasoned predators, accustomed to exploiting distressed corporate assets. They recognized the glaring technical deficiencies in the presentation my sister delivered. However, their greed temporarily eclipsed their operational caution. They knew the legitimate routing software generated substantial revenue for the maritime industry. Believing they had cornered a lucrative intellectual property portfolio for a fraction of its true market value, they decided to lock down the negotiation before any competitors could emerge. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky casting a gray pallor over the Louisiana landscape. I sat at my kitchen island, monitoring the encrypted financial tracking scripts I deployed earlier in the week. A sharp chime echoed from my laptop speakers, breaking the morning silence. The notification signaled a significant transaction hitting the federal wire system. The Texas Lending Syndicate had officially initiated an earnest money deposit to secure their exclusive licensing rights. The digital ledger updated in real time, displaying a transfer of $250,000. In a standard corporate acquisition, earnest capital is routed into an impartial escrow account managed by a neutral legal entity pending a comprehensive due diligence review. But my family bypassed standard procedures to execute their forgery. Because they utilized the dummy corporation Crescent Marine Holdings, the syndicate routing numbers directed the fortune into a vulnerable commercial holding account. From there, a pre-programmed sweep function instantly forwarded the entire balance into a personal checking account. That specific account belonged solely to Jessica. I leaned closer to the high-resolution screen, watching the cascading lines of financial data. I possessed read-only access to her transaction history through a backdoor exploit I engineered during her failed pet boutique venture years ago. She had begged me to fix her disorganized point-of-sale system, and I left a permanent digital window open just in case her incompetence ever threatened my own stability. That foresight was now paying exceptional dividends. I could see every dollar moving through her ledger as if I were sitting inside the bank vault. The $250,000 deposit landed in her ledger with a heavy digital thud. A prudent executive would leave those funds untouched, recognizing them as a conditional placeholder rather than liquid revenue. Jessica, however, possessed the financial restraint of a starving scavenger. She had spent her entire adult life running from creditors, hiding past due notices in desk drawers, and relying on our father to write rescue checks. The sight of a positive six-figure balance triggered an immediate, impulsive reaction. Within 45 minutes of the wire clearing the Federal Reserve, the initial outbound transfers began. I watched the green numbers in her balance turn red as she initiated a frantic sequence of electronic payments. First, she wired $80,000 to a luxury automotive dealership in Metairie. For the past 6 months, she had been driving a pristine white sports car while frantically dodging repossession agents. The dealership had been threatening legal action. She cleared the outstanding lease balance, securing the title to a vehicle she could never legitimately afford. Next, she targeted her unsecured debt. Payments of $15,000, $20,000, and $35,000 fired across the banking network, wiping out the balances on 4 separate platinum credit cards. These were the same cards she maxed out, funding lavish promotional parties for startups that never actually produced a viable product. She treated business capital like a personal inheritance, assuming there would always be a safety net waiting to catch her when the bills arrived. The rapid depletion continued unabated. She dispersed smaller chunks of capital to local vendors. A caterer she stiffed a year ago received a sudden windfall. A boutique public relations firm in downtown Baton Rouge finally got paid for a disastrous social media campaign. Jessica was frantically plugging the holes in her sinking personal life using money stolen from a dangerous commercial syndicate. I took a slow breath, the scent of my dark roast coffee mingling with the cool air conditioning of my apartment. Seeing her squander a fortune in real time resurrected a vivid childhood memory. I was 16, working a weekend shift managing inventory at a local hardware store to save money for a decent computer processor. Jessica was 12. She walked into a high-end department store and shoplifted a designer silver bracelet simply because she liked how it sparkled under the glass case. When the store security detained her, Richard rushed to the scene. He did not punish her or make her apologize. He pulled out a wad of cash, paid the store manager double the retail price to drop the charges, and bought her an ice cream cone on the way home. He taught her that consequences were malleable. He ingrained in her mind that bad behavior could always be erased if you found the right victim to absorb the cost. She viewed this syndicate deposit as another permanent victory. In her mind, she had successfully outsmarted the system, negotiated a brilliant deal, and erased her financial sins. She sat in her luxury apartment, likely admiring her zeroed-out credit statements, entirely ignorant of the brutal mechanisms governing interstate commerce. By accepting and instantly liquidating the earnest money under fraudulent pretenses, she crossed a fatal legal threshold. She was no longer just playing dress-up in my lobby or floating a forged document past a lazy country club notary. She had executed a textbook case of wire fraud. Corporate law features severe clawback provisions designed to protect lenders from this exact scenario. When a pending acquisition collapses, the earnest funds must be returned immediately. If the capital is missing, the offense shifts from a civil contract dispute into a federal criminal investigation. The syndicate was no longer a distant, disinterested lender tossing a lifeline to a struggling freight company. By stealing their $250,000 deposit, Jessica transformed those ruthless men into active, defrauded parties. They were now heavily invested victims with a distinct financial motive to tear her apart. She successfully tied a heavy, undeniable anchor around her own neck. She operated under the arrogant assumption that I would silently absorb the incoming shockwave, just like I had absorbed the blame and the burden throughout our entire lives. She believed her forged signature bound my legitimate assets to her reckless behavior, forcing me to surrender my software to the Texans to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. She failed to realize my assets were shielded by an impenetrable trust. When the syndicate came to collect, they would find an empty vault. The only thing left on the table would be her own fraudulent signature and the hollow shell of her dummy corporation. The transaction logs on my screen settled into an ominous stillness. The $250,000 was gone, dissolved into the ether of paid debts and automotive titles. Jessica had fired the starting gun for her own destruction. The men in Dallas were fast, efficient, and entirely devoid of mercy. They wired the funds based on a forged premise, but they would not finalize the licensing agreement on blind faith. The trap was set and the bait was consumed. The syndicate would not wait long to verify their investment. Standard operating procedure for a transaction of this magnitude dictated an immediate, rigorous verification of ownership. They needed to ensure the proprietary algorithms they purchased were free of external encumbrances. They were about to initiate a formal title audit. When their forensic accountants discovered the discrepancy between my legitimate registry and her fraudulent shell company, the illusion would shatter instantly. The collision was inevitable, pushing the crisis toward a point of no return. The afternoon sun filtered through the tinted floor-to-ceiling windows of my secure downtown office. Jessica believes she controlled this building because she possessed a brass lobby key, but she remained entirely ignorant of the private subterranean garage and the dedicated biometric elevator that serviced my executive suite directly. I sat behind my polished mahogany desk, surrounded by the quiet hum of the primary server banks. I did not need to hide. I was simply waiting for the inevitable collision. On my center monitor, a specialized digital tripwire lay dormant. I had programmed a custom subroutine to monitor all queries directed at the State Commercial Registry regarding Crescent Marine Logistics. At precisely 2:14 in the afternoon, the screen flashed a steady amber warning. The digital ping registered on my encrypted server. The legal department representing the Texas Lending Syndicate had officially initiated their formal title audit. This was the standard verification procedure for any high-stakes intellectual property transaction. The men from Dallas were ruthless predators, but they were not fools. They had wired a $250,000 earnest deposit based on a forged promissory note and a desperate pitch. Now, before they finalized the permanent licensing agreement, their attorneys needed to verify the chain of custody. They needed to confirm that the asset they were buying was free of external liens and legal encumbrances. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, steepening my fingers. I did not panic. I did not type frantic commands to block their inquiry or obscure the data. Corporate defense relies on structure, not emotion. The legal fortress I constructed 3 years ago was designed for this exact moment. Watching the incoming data packets felt like observing a hunter stalk a phantom. I tracked the syndicate lawyers as their automated software scraped the state databases. They pulled the municipal tax records. They retrieved the initial articles of incorporation. They were searching for the name Jessica Brown, attempting to validate her authority as the primary signatory. They were looking for the dummy corporation she registered. Instead, they slammed into an immovable object. The system generated a stark, indisputable reality. They hit the reinforced titanium wall of my irrevocable trust. I remembered sitting in my estate attorney office in Houston 3 years prior. The room smelled of old paper and strong espresso. My lawyer was a pragmatic woman who understood that bloodlines often harbor the most dangerous thieves. We spent hours drafting the protective clauses. I explained how my mother Vivian treated my revenue like a personal slush fund, and how my father Richard viewed my labor as his rightful property. The attorney did not offer hollow sympathy. She offered a structural solution. By transferring every patent, every line of proprietary source code, and the deed to my commercial real estate into the trust, I effectively erased my personal ownership. I became the sole trustee of an independent financial entity. An irrevocable trust operates like a sovereign vault. Once the assets cross the threshold, they can never be reclaimed, altered, or seized by outside creditors. Not even the original owner can dissolve the arrangement without a complex judicial decree. The digital footprint on my screen illustrated the Texas attorneys hitting that exact legal dead end. Their search queries bounced back with automated denial codes. The registry clearly displayed the sole ownership of Crescent Marine Logistics, belonging entirely to the Maribel Brown Tech Security Trust. Jessica possessed zero actual equity. She held zero signatory authority. The assets she promised during her clandestine French Quarter meeting did not belong to her. The collateral Richard pledged to secure his initial fraudulent bridge loan was legally untouchable. The official documents proved that my sister and my father had attempted to sell a ghost. The ramifications of that discovery rippled through the digital ether. The fraudulent contract Jessica signed in Dallas was instantly exposed as worthless paper. They had utilized a corrupt Baton Rouge notary to authenticate a fantasy. My silence over the past few days was not a symptom of defeat. It was a calculated, tactical retreat. I had allowed them to build a towering house of cards on a foundation of federal wire fraud, knowing the entire structure would collapse the moment a competent lawyer reviewed the foundational deed. I visualized the chaotic scene unfolding inside the syndicate corporate headquarters. A team of highly paid attorneys was likely storming into the executive boardroom, waving the state registry printouts. The realization would hit the investors like a physical blow. They had been conned. A desperate, failing freight operator and his financially illiterate daughter had successfully tricked a sophisticated lending syndicate into wiring a staggering sum of liquid capital. The Texans were not the type of men who handled deception with grace. They operated outside the bounds of polite corporate mediation. They did not file standard civil grievances or wait for slow judicial arbitrations. They resolved their disputes through immediate, ruthless enforcement. My sister was currently oblivious to the impending disaster. I could access her social media feeds through an anonymized proxy account. Just 10 minutes prior, she had posted a photograph of herself holding a shopping bag from a luxury boutique in the Garden District. She attached a caption celebrating her new chapter as a female chief executive. She was busy celebrating her fraudulent windfall, spending stolen earnest money to project an aura of unearned success. She believed she had conquered her financial demons and secured her future. She remained entirely unaware that the money paying for those designer clothes belonged to dangerous individuals who now understood she was a thief. She had drained the holding account, paying off car leases and credit cards, leaving nothing behind to return when the deal inevitably evaporated. She lacked the capacity to comprehend the concept of corporate clawback provisions. She thought she was invincible. In standard family dynamics, a sibling might intervene. A normal sister might pick up the phone and warn her family that a syndicate of angry lenders was about to discover their multi-million-dollar fraud. But my family had made their choice at that country club dinner. They ordered me to hand over the keys to my life and walk away. I simply followed their instructions. I walked away and locked the impenetrable door behind me. The legal barrier I constructed held firm. The intellectual property was safe locked away in a digital fortress no court order could breach. The syndicate could not touch my routing algorithms. They could not seize my servers. They could not liquidate my real estate. Their anger needed a viable target, and the state registry provided them with two names, Richard and Jessica Brown. The shift in leverage was instantaneous and profound. The Texans were no longer interested in acquiring a maritime logistics firm. They were now heavily invested in retrieving their stolen capital and extracting a heavy penalty for the disrespect shown to their organization. They pivoted from eager buyers to defrauded predators. I watched the final verification query drop off my server log. The audit was complete. The truth was out in the open, resting on a mahogany conference table in Dallas. My family had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence, preferring the superficial charm of a golden child over the quiet competence of a structural engineer. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of a coordinated domestic ambush. They believed a loud voice and a forged signature were enough to conquer an empire. Now they were about to face an adversary that did not care about Southern high society gossip or patriarchal entitlement. The Texas Syndicate was preparing to mobilize. The initial shockwave of the audit failure was already traveling down the interstate. By the time the sun set over the Louisiana bayou, my father would receive a phone call that would shatter his manufactured reality. The syndicate was about to turn its wrath directly onto Gulf Coast Transit, forcing Richard to confront the catastrophic debt he tried to hide and the dangerous enemies he created. The predators were hungry, and my family was entirely out of bait. The silence inside my apartment shattered at precisely 4 in the afternoon. My encrypted communication interceptor flagged a priority incoming transmission directed at the Gulf Coast Transit servers. The men from Dallas did not wait until Monday morning to express their displeasure. The regional director of the lending firm bypassed standard corporate pleasantries entirely. He did not send a polite email requesting clarification regarding the failed title audit. He dispatched a digitized formal demand letter laced with predatory legal threats. I routed the document to my secondary monitor, reading the text as it simultaneously flooded Richard's primary inbox. The demand was instantaneous and brutal. The document required the immediate return of the $250,000 earnest money deposit. Furthermore, the contract stipulated a draconian penalty fee for misrepresenting intellectual property during a commercial negotiation. The director granted them exactly 24 hours to wire the funds back to the holding account before initiating federal litigation. I knew the impossible nature of that ultimatum. I watched the transaction logs empty out earlier that same day. Jessica possessed zero liquidity. She had already funneled the stolen capital into luxury car leases, unsecured credit card debt, and overdue vendor invoices. The holding account belonging to her dummy corporation held a balance of exactly $13.42. The money was gone, scattered to the wind in a desperate attempt to finance her superficial lifestyle. When a debtor fails to return conditional capital under fraudulent pretenses, commercial lenders do not negotiate, they execute. 15 minutes after the initial demand letter hit the inbox, a second notification flashed across my screen. This document was far more lethal. The syndicate formally declared a breach of contract regarding the failed software acquisition, but they did not stop there. The lawyers activated the acceleration clause buried deep within the fine print of Richard's original. An acceleration clause is the ultimate financial guillotine. It instantly converts a manageable monthly payment schedule into an immediate lump sum obligation. Because Richard co-signed the fraudulent pledge, using my algorithms as fake collateral, the failure of the licensing deal triggered a default on his primary debt. He no longer owed the Texans a series of scheduled installments. He owed them the entire principal balance, plus exorbitant default interest, due immediately upon receipt of the notice. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands. The digital surveillance feeds from the freight warehouse painted a grim picture. The dispatch screens remained dark from my earlier blockade, but now a new chaos erupted. The centralized phone system on the operations floor lit up like a localized lightning storm. My father's private cellular device began ringing incessantly. I could see him through the grainy security camera feed, pacing the length of his glass-enclosed office. He pressed the phone to his ear, his face contorting into a mask of pure terror. The regional director was not just sending paperwork. He was making direct contact. The audio intercept crackled with static before clarifying into a chillingly calm baritone. The regional director did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice. True power never requires a raised volume. He recited Richard's social security number, the exact physical address of the freight warehouse, and the license plate number of Jessica's new sports car. He laid out the arithmetic of their doom with surgical precision. Every word spoken across the cellular connection dismantled another pillar of my father's fragile ego. I watched the security feed as Richard sank heavily into his cracked leather desk chair. His shoulders slumped forward, carrying the invisible weight of his impending destruction. The man who ordered me to leave my office keys on a dining table was now begging a stranger for an extension he would never receive. Richard's traditionalist bluster evaporated into the humid Louisiana air. For 3 decades, he ruled his regional shipping empire through physical intimidation. He bullied local mechanics, haggled ruthlessly with independent drivers, and screamed at port authorities to secure favorable loading times. He believed a loud voice and a heavy fist were the ultimate tools of authority. He engineered a trap designed to enslave my future, expecting me to cower under his patriarchal shadow. Now he found himself and his golden child locked inside a cage of their own making. He realized with crushing certainty that physical intimidation could not stop a ruthless corporate entity from executing a financial slaughter. You cannot yell at a balance sheet. You cannot punch an acceleration clause. The syndicate did not care about his pride. They did not care about the decades he spent building his small fleet of diesel trucks. They were entirely indifferent to Vivian and her manicured country club reputation. The lenders only cared about extracting the capital owed to them by any means necessary. The panic inside the Baton Rouge estate reached a fever pitch by early evening. I tracked the location data of Jessica's mobile phone. She fled the downtown luxury boutiques the moment Richard summoned her, returning to the sprawling suburban house she thought represented impenetrable wealth. Jessica's arrival at the estate was marked by a frantic burst of digital activity. I observed her phone pinging the local wireless network. She attempted to log into her banking portal 17 times in a span of 4 minutes, hoping a miraculous accounting error would restore the vanished funds. When the digital ledger repeatedly displayed a negative balance, she began calling the vendors she paid earlier that morning. She pleaded with the luxury car dealership to reverse the wire transfer, claiming a sudden family emergency. The dealership manager simply hung up the phone. Her tears were useless. The practiced smile she used to charm country club investors held zero currency in the brutal arena of debt collection. Vivian undoubtedly paced the hardwood floors of the foyer, her diamond rings clinking against her crystal wine glass. She spent the entire week spreading vicious rumors about my character, attempting to ostracize me from Southern high society. Now that same society was about to witness her public evisceration. When federal marshals arrive to seize commercial assets, they do not employ discretion. They arrive with heavy trucks, visible badges, and public documentation. The neighbors would see everything. The carefully curated illusion of generational wealth she sacrificed my future to protect was disintegrating in real time. They were trapped in a paradox of their own design. They needed my legitimate company to satisfy the predators they invited into their lives, but my company was shielded by the irrevocable trust. The syndicate was preparing to gut his entire remaining livelihood to balance the ledger. The lawyers in Dallas were already drafting the asset seizure protocols, targeting the physical trucks, the warehouse leases, and any liquid capital remaining in the Gulf Coast Transit operating accounts. But commercial predators rarely stop at business assets when dealing with fraud. They hunt for personal vulnerability. As I monitored the syndicate automated search queries probing Richard's background, I noticed their algorithms pulling municipal property records. The Texans were looking for anything of value they could attach a lien against to recoup their missing $250,000. I opened a new search window, mirroring the query path the syndicate lawyers were following. I bypassed the standard commercial filings and dove into the residential archives of East Baton Rouge Parish. I wanted to see exactly what the Texans were about to find. I pulled the master deed from my parents' sprawling estate. The property was a colonial revival mansion sitting on 3 acres of prime real estate. For years, Vivian paraded that house as the ultimate symbol of their untouchable status. As the official municipal document loaded onto my screen, the complex web of their deception grew even darker. The home was not owned free and clear. It was not even mortgaged through a standard local bank. The deed contained a recent amendment filed just under a year ago. It was a secondary pledge, a silent lien buried beneath layers of bureaucratic jargon. My father did not just forge my signature to secure the initial bridge loan for Jessica. Long before he dragged my software into his fraudulent scheme, he had utilized another source of leverage to keep his sinking ship afloat. I traced the signature line on the secondary property lien. The name inked on the official parish document sent a sudden chill down my spine. The financial slaughter the syndicate was preparing to execute was only the visible surface of the threat. By following the trail of the Dallas lawyers, I was about to discover their darkest hidden collateral. The municipal deed to the Baton Rouge estate materialized on my glowing monitor. The dense legal text scrolled downward, revealing the specific encumbrances tied to the property. I kept my eyes fixed on the final signature block. My father did not merely forge my name to secure a commercial bridge loan for his favorite daughter. He engineered a far more dangerous failsafe. He cross-collateralized the entire arrangement. To satisfy the predatory requirements of the Texas lending syndicate, he pledged the family home as a secondary guarantee. The estate was the ultimate symbol of a rotting Southern aristocracy. From the street, the property projected an aura of invincible generational wealth. Imposing white columns framed the wide front porch. Ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss lined the circular driveway. Manicured azalea bushes bloomed in vibrant pinks, hiding the cracked brick foundation underneath. It was a pristine facade built to impress superficial observers. But behind the heavy oak doors, the reality was entirely different. The interior was crumbling under the weight of hidden mortgages and decades of deferred maintenance. My mother, Vivian, derived her entire identity from that mansion. She hosted lavish charity galas in the sprawling backyard garden. She served expensive champagne on the veranda, wearing designer jewelry she could ill afford. She viewed the brick and mortar as a sacred temple dedicated to her social status. She believed the house cemented her place at the top of the local country club hierarchy. She remained entirely unaware that the roof over her head, the very foundation of her high society persona, was legally tethered to a group of ruthless corporate liquidators. Richard gambled 3 decades of accrued equity on the non-existent business acumen of his golden child. He bet the family sanctuary on a daughter who spent her youth running from creditors and failing at basic endeavors. He kept the secret buried deep in his office filing cabinets. He likely rationalized the risk by convincing himself my technology firm would generate enough excess capital to erase the lien before the Texans ever came knocking. He assumed he could steal my life work, validate the forged collateral, and quietly pay off the secondary guarantee without Vivian ever discovering his monumental failure. But the failed title audit earlier that afternoon triggered a fatal chain reaction. The syndicate realized the primary collateral was locked inside my irrevocable trust. They recognized my software was untouchable. The fraudulent contract Jessica signed was exposed as worthless paper. The lenders immediately pivoted to the only viable asset left on the table. The acceleration clause activated. The syndicate was no longer waiting for monthly installments. They were preparing to file their commercial liens against the physical property. I watched the municipal registry system update in real time. The mansion was currently scheduled for the auction block. The legal machinery of foreclosure was already in motion. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the silence of my secure office wash over me. The cool air conditioning provided a sharp contrast to the heated revelation burning on my screen. In a standard narrative of vengeance, a betrayed daughter might relish the poetic justice of the moment. I could easily sit back and let the commercial predators execute their foreclosure. I could watch my toxic relatives face the harsh reality of homelessness as a natural consequence of their deception. The mental image of federal marshals carrying Vivian antique furniture out to the curb offered a fleeting sense of vindication. However, I operate on financial logic rather than emotional vindication. Allowing an external entity to profit from the ruin of my family was an inefficient waste of capital. The syndicate wanted their $250,000 back plus penalty fees. They wanted to liquidate the estate quickly to balance their ruined ledger. If they auctioned the property to the highest bidder, they would capture the remaining equity for themselves. I refused to let a group of Dallas loan sharks enrich their corporate portfolio using the bones of my childhood home. I decided I would acquire the estate myself. I opened a secure, encrypted communication channel to my private wealth manager. He operated out of a quiet boutique firm in Zurich, accustomed to handling complex, anonymous transactions. I drafted a concise directive. I instructed him to prepare an immediate cash purchase offer for the distressed debt held by the Texas syndicate. Commercial lenders are pragmatic entities. They prefer liquid cash in hand over the lengthy, drawn-out process of a contested real estate foreclosure. If I offered to buy the paper holding the lien, they would gladly transfer the ownership of the debt to my trust. The strategy was flawless. The syndicate would get their money back, washing their hands of the fraudulent mess Jessica created. In exchange, my trust would become the primary lien holder. I would hold the deed. I would own the ground beneath my father's feet. I needed him to understand the rapidly shifting landscape of his own destruction. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed his direct private number. He answered on the first ring. His breathing echoed through the small speaker, heavy, ragged, and frantic. The regional director from Dallas had already shattered his nerves earlier in the day. He likely expected another threat from Texas demanding money he did not possess. "Hello, Richard," I said, keeping my tone flat and conversational. "I spent the afternoon reviewing the municipal property filings for the house. I see you attached the deed to the bridge loan." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the cellular connection. The background noise of the paralyzed dispatch warehouse seemed to fade away. He knew he was caught. He knew the devastating secret he kept from Vivian was finally exposed to the light. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "The syndicate is preparing to foreclose," I informed him, my voice devoid of sympathy. "They want their capital back by tomorrow, but I am not going to let them take the house. I am buying the distressed debt. My wealth manager is wiring the funds to Dallas right now. By Monday morning, the Maribel Brown Tech Security Trust will hold the primary mortgage on the estate. You will no longer owe the Texans a single dime. You will owe me." The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The psychological weight of the situation drove him to sheer madness. For his entire life, he maintained control through intimidation and volume. He dictated the rules. Now his outcast daughter held the title to his sanctuary. He began to shout. The growly timbre of his voice cracked under the immense strain. He cursed my name, spewing venom into the receiver. He threatened to burn the mansion to the ground before he let me take it from him. He accused me of destroying the family he had sacrificed everything to build, conveniently forgetting his own hand in the forgery. His volume escalated into a chaotic, primal roar of pure desperation. He sounded like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. I listened to his unraveling with detached fascination. He was a man drowning in a storm of his own creation, furious at the only person offering a lifeboat. But my lifeboat came with terms his fragile ego could not stomach. He could not accept being subservient to the child he discarded. I ended the call, leaving him to scream into a dead connection. I set the phone down on the polished mahogany desk. He was cornered. His freight business was paralyzed by the digital blockade. His home was forfeit. And Vivian was still planning her weekend social events, entirely oblivious to the impending eviction. Richard had only one desperate option left. He could not win on paper. He could not win in the courtroom. He needed to find a way to bypass my digital firewall and physically seize the servers before the transfer of the debt finalized. He believed that if he could just get his hands on the proprietary code, he could somehow reverse the tide. The conflict was no longer confined to legal threats and financial maneuvers. The situation was escalating rapidly, shifting from white-collar fraud into the realm of physical desperation. He was preparing to breach the fortress. The nocturnal hum of the New Orleans metropolis drifted through my reinforced triple-pane windows, casting a rhythmic ambiance across the darkened living room. I sat perfectly still, bathed in the soft blue luminescence of my workstation. The financial maneuver I executed earlier that evening remained locked within the secure servers of my Swiss wealth management firm. The electronic transfer of capital flowed flawlessly across the Atlantic, finalizing the acquisition of the secondary mortgage attached to the Baton Rouge estate. I transformed from a discarded daughter into the primary lien holder of my father's most prized possession. The defensive phase of my strategy had concluded successfully. The digital clock illuminated 11:30 when the heavy brass deadbolt securing my entryway suddenly rattled with explosive violence. The sheer force of the impact reverberated through the drywall, sending a tremor down the hallway. Someone was attempting to kick the reinforced steel barrier off its hinges. I did not flinch. I did not reach for my cellular phone to dial emergency services. I recognized the frantic cadence of that heavy fist pounding against the stained mahogany wood. The desperate visitor was Richard. My father bypassed the 24-hour lobby concierge, most likely utilizing a combination of aggressive bullying and large denomination currency to gain unauthorized access to the residential elevator banks. He stood on the opposite side of the threshold, breathing like a hunted beast, attempting to solve a sophisticated corporate crisis through brute force. This behavior aligned perfectly with his historical methodology. Decades ago, during the late 1980s, Richard constructed the foundation of Gulf Coast Transit, using physical intimidation as his primary business instrument. Back when the maritime shipping industry relied on handwritten manifests and analog dispatch boards, he dominated the local loading docks through sheer spatial presence. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, utilizing his massive frame to intimidate rival freight operators and bully union representatives into accepting substandard contracts. He learned early in his career that if you screamed loud enough and invaded the personal space of your adversaries, they would inevitably surrender their leverage simply to escape the confrontation. He viewed every obstacle as a nail requiring a heavy hammer. Tonight, however, his archaic hammer was entirely useless against a modern digital fortress. He pounded on the doorframe again, the metal hinges groaning under the immense pressure. His voice echoed down the quiet corridor, thick with a toxic cocktail of panic, rage, and absolute desperation. He demanded I open the door immediately. He shouted that he carried a rapid dissolution contract in his briefcase, requiring my immediate signature to hand over the trust assets and save his precious estate from the impending commercial foreclosure. He bellowed into the empty hallway, projecting his patriarchal fury toward the unyielding wood. He expected a terrified girl to unlock the door. He anticipated that his thunderous voice would trigger a deeply ingrained childhood reflex, forcing me to submit to his authority. He believed that the sheer volume of his anger could somehow override federal corporate statutes and legally binding financial structures. I listened to him construct his twisted narrative of familial obligation through the barrier. He shouted that I owed him my very existence. He claimed a daughter must always sacrifice her personal ambitions for the preservation of her bloodline. He demanded I surrender my proprietary software algorithms, my commercial real estate, and my entire financial future to erase a catastrophic debt he created while trying to steal my company. The staggering hypocrisy of his demands painted a pathetic portrait of a tyrant who had completely lost control of his empire. I remained seated in the quiet darkness of my apartment. I calmly reached across the polished glass surface of my desk and picked up my command tablet. My thumb brushed the biometric sensor, unlocking the administrative dashboard. I tapped a single icon, activating the high-definition security array I installed discreetly in the exterior hallway ceiling 3 months prior. The wide aspect screen instantly filled with a pristine 4,000-pixel resolution broadcast of the corridor. The infrared sensors automatically adjusted the exposure, capturing every pathetic detail of his nocturnal ambush. I watched my father pace frantically across the patterned carpet. His bespoke tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled and stained with perspiration. His silk tie hung loose around his thick neck. His face, flushed with a dangerous crimson hue, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The man who spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable Southern aristocracy now looked like a desperate vagrant begging for salvation outside a locked vault. I pressed the microphone icon located at the bottom corner of the application interface, activating the two-way audio system. "Your physical presence holds zero leverage here," I informed him, my voice cold and entirely clinical, slicing through the quiet hallway speakers like a surgical scalpel. Richard flinched visibly as the disembodied sound of my voice echoed around him. He spun wildly, searching for the source of the audio before his bloodshot eyes locked onto the small, black dome mounted above my entryway. "You cannot intimidate a legal entity," I continued, my tone devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "The trust is impenetrable. Your shouting changes absolutely nothing about your current financial reality. You are trespassing on private property. Leave this building immediately, or I transmit this unedited footage directly to the municipal police department." He stared upward at the security housing. Inside the protective glass, a tiny red light-emitting diode pulsed steadily, indicating the active recording status. That single glowing crimson dot represented the absolute termination of his power. He realized in that agonizing moment that he could not punch a digital camera, he could not strangle a remote server, he could not bully an automated legal mechanism. His entire arsenal of physical coercion was rendered completely obsolete. The patriarch slumped his broad shoulders, the remaining adrenaline rapidly draining from his exhausted body. The fight evaporated from his eyes, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man comprehending the totality of his destruction. He looked down at the rapid dissolution contract trembling in his right hand. The document was nothing more than worthless paper, carrying no authority and offering no salvation. He turned away from my door, dragging his feet heavily across the carpet as he retreated toward the elevator bank. I watched the digital feed until the stainless steel doors slid shut, swallowing his defeated silhouette entirely. The corridor returned to a state of absolute silence. I deactivated the microphone and saved the high-definition video file securely onto multiple redundant offshore servers. The footage constituted undeniable proof of his aggressive extortion attempt, providing me with a devastating legal weapon should he ever attempt to challenge my authority in a formal courtroom setting. Sitting in the tranquil solitude of my living space, I felt a profound internal shift. For the entirety of my adult life, I operated from a defensive posture, constantly building firewalls, shielding my assets, and deflecting their relentless attempts to exploit my intellect. I constructed the irrevocable trust strictly to protect myself from their greed. I acquired the secondary mortgage simply to prevent the lending syndicate from profiting off my family ruin. I had merely neutralized their attacks. But neutralization was no longer sufficient. Richard's nocturnal assault proved that they would never stop trying to break through my defenses, as long as they possessed a shred of social capital or public credibility. They would continue to scheme, lie, and forge documents until their entire corrupt foundation was completely dismantled. The time for passive resistance had officially expired. I was ready to go on the offensive. I opened a new encrypted window on my workstation, accessing a vast database of municipal permits, zoning regulations, and private country club membership charters. If Richard derived his power from physical intimidation, Vivian derived her power from superficial social status. She funded her elaborate galas and exclusive society memberships using the very same fraudulent capital that was now evaporating. I decided my next target would not be a bank account or a commercial warehouse. I would dismantle the carefully curated public facade that my mother valued above her own children. The coming sunrise would not just bring a new day, it would bring a meticulous surgical strike against the epicenter of Baton Rouge high society, setting the stage for a public humiliation they could never erase. The morning sun crested over the Mississippi River, casting a pale industrial light across the skyline of New Orleans. My workstation remained active, humming quietly after the chaotic midnight encounter. The digital security footage of my father, retreating in absolute defeat, replayed on a loop across my secondary monitor. Watching his heavy shoulders slump under the weight of his own powerlessness signaled the definitive end of my defensive posture. For years, I operated as a shield, constantly deflecting the relentless greed of my relatives. I built firewalls and established trusts simply to protect my intellectual property from their grasping hands. But survival is not synonymous with victory. Neutralizing a threat only delays the inevitable return of the predator. To ensure permanent security, I needed to completely eradicate their capacity to wage war. I poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and transitioned immediately into a hostile acquisition strategy. I required an aggressive proxy to execute the maneuver. I opened a secure communication channel and contacted a specialized corporate broker located in the financial district of Manhattan. This individual operated entirely outside the insular gossip circles of Louisiana high society. He possessed no emotional connection to the Southern aristocracy and cared nothing for country club lineage. His firm specialized in the swift, ruthless acquisition of distressed liabilities. I provided him with a precise set of instructions and authorized the creation of an anonymous holding company registered in Delaware. We named the new entity Crescent Strategic Acquisitions. The nomenclature provided a subtle irony entirely lost on the men it would soon dismantle. Growing up, I watched my father conduct his shipping business through a primitive lens of physical intimidation and local cronyism. He bullied regional bankers into approving questionable equipment loans and relied heavily on the good old boy network to sustain his crumbling empire. He believed true power resided in a loud voice and a firm handshake. I chose a different path. I operated within a borderless digital economy where capital functioned with cold mathematical precision. My logistics software generated massive streams of legitimate recurring revenue from international shipping conglomerates. I never squandered my earnings on superficial displays of wealth. While my sister Jessica financed luxury car leases and hosted extravagant promotional parties to project an illusion of success, I quietly amassed a formidable treasury of liquid assets. That quiet discipline provided me with the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. Through my Manhattan intermediary, I approached the Texas Lending Syndicate. The executives in Dallas were currently staring at a catastrophic liability. They realized their $250,000 earnest money deposit had evaporated into thin air, consumed by my sister and her fraudulent dummy corporation. They understood that the intellectual property they desperately wanted to acquire was permanently locked inside my impenetrable legal trust. Their only remaining option to recoup their stolen funds involved executing a painful commercial foreclosure on a decaying residential estate in Baton Rouge. Financial organizations despise residential foreclosures. Seizing a family home requires navigating unpredictable local courts, dealing with expensive property taxes, managing physical maintenance, and waiting several months to successfully auction the asset. Corporate lenders prefer immediate liquidity over drawn-out legal battles in unfamiliar jurisdictions. They want clean balance sheets, not neglected mansions. My broker presented the Texans with a blind, all-cash buyout offer for the entire distressed portfolio belonging to my family. We proposed purchasing the forged promissory notes, the massive earnest money liabilities, and the cross-collateralized guarantee on the Baton Rouge property. The offer presented a slight discount, providing the syndicate with exactly 80 cents on every dollar owed. The negotiation was incredibly swift and entirely emotionless. The men in Dallas recognized a perfect exit strategy from a fraudulent mess. They accepted the terms without a single moment of hesitation. They were eager to wash their hands of the incompetent Baton Rouge freight operator and his thieving daughter. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the final digital contracts materialized on my primary screen. I reviewed the complex transfer documents, ensuring every legal loophole was firmly closed. The paperwork contained the original loan agreements bearing the forged signature Jessica created. It included the severe penalty clauses triggered by the failed title audit. Most importantly, it contained the primary deed to the sprawling family estate. I authorized the release of funds from my offshore wealth management account. The massive wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve Network seamlessly, bypassing standard banking delays through a prioritized institutional routing number. In the span of exactly 24 hours, the fundamental balance of power permanently shifted. I was no longer the exiled daughter desperately defending a software company against a coordinated domestic ambush. I emerged from the digital shadows as a sovereign financial entity. I became the sole primary creditor, holding the absolute leash to my father and his entire existence. The magnitude of the transaction settled over me with a profound sense of clarity. I legally owned the crippling financial anchor currently strangling his precious golden child. Every single dollar Jessica stole from the syndicate was now owed directly to my anonymous holding company. Furthermore, I possessed the absolute legal authority to evict my own parents from their cherished home. While the digital ink dried on my monitors, my mother Vivian was most likely oblivious to her impending doom. She was probably sitting on her expansive rear patio, finalizing the floral arrangements for an upcoming charity gala. She derived her entire identity from the brick and mortar of that house. She believed those white columns and manicured lawns cemented her place at the absolute pinnacle of Southern society. She treated the estate as an impenetrable fortress of generational wealth, completely unaware that the ground beneath her designer shoes now belonged entirely to the child she banished. Jessica was likely hiding in her childhood bedroom, paralyzed by the consequences of her actions. She spent the previous day frantically ignoring phone calls from aggressive vendors and luxury car dealerships attempting to reverse her fraudulent wire transfers. She believed she had ruined her own life, but she still operated under the delusion that Richard would somehow miraculously fix the situation. She expected her powerful father to yell at the right people and make the scary corporate men go away. She did not comprehend that her father was now completely castrated by the very same corporate mechanics he tried to exploit. Richard understood the gravity of the situation, but he remained ignorant of the true identity of his new master. He knew a Delaware holding company had purchased his debt, saving him from immediate ruin at the hands of the Dallas syndicate. He likely viewed this anonymous acquisition as a temporary stay of execution, a brief window of opportunity to gather his remaining resources and launch another desperate offensive. He had no idea he was preparing to wage war against a mirror. I held the physical manifestation of their arrogance in my digital vault. I could have simply instructed my legal team to file the eviction notices immediately. I could have authorized the local sheriff department to arrive at the mansion on Monday morning, dragging their antique furniture onto the front lawn for the entire neighborhood to witness. The natural consequence of their betrayal offered a swift and brutal resolution. But a simple eviction lacked the necessary theatrical weight. Merely taking their home and bankrupting their freight business felt entirely too sterile. They spent decades manipulating my emotions, minimizing my achievements, and treating my loyalty as an expendable resource. I needed them to understand the full comprehensive scope of their defeat. I required them to look directly into the eyes of the architect who engineered their destruction. They needed to believe they still possessed a sliver of hope. People fight hardest when they think a narrow escape route remains open. If I cornered them with immediate legal paperwork, they would simply collapse into despair. I wanted them to walk willingly into the abyss, believing they were stepping toward salvation. I needed to construct a scenario where their own unyielding arrogance would deliver the final, fatal blow. I closed the acquisition files and opened a fresh document on my screen. I began drafting a highly specific piece of correspondence. It was not a demand for payment, nor was it a notice of foreclosure. It was an invitation disguised as a legal settlement. I prepared to send the ultimate bait to lure my desperate toxic family into a final inescapable trap. The trap required a highly specific type of bait, meticulously designed to exploit the fatal flaw buried deep within their shared psychology. I did not summon an expensive legal team to draft a magnificent parchment. People who rely entirely upon superficial appearances fundamentally misunderstand the underlying mechanics of true power. They mistakenly believe authority must always announce itself with loud trumpets, heavy cardstock, and prominent gold lettering. Therefore, I intentionally composed the formal default notice utilizing the most mundane supplies available in my apartment. I selected a single ream of cheap 20-pound copy paper from a discount office supply retailer. The sheets felt exceptionally flimsy and translucent, completely devoid of any textured watermark or sophisticated weight. I typed the devastating financial realities using a generic standard serif font. There was no embossed corporate logo situated at the top margin of the page. No glossy seals or intricate borders decorated the corners. It appeared exactly like a rudimentary document printed by an entry-level municipal clerk. I sealed the pages inside a plain white envelope and dispatched a local independent process server to deliver the package directly to the Baton Rouge estate. The delivery occurred just before noon on a sweltering Louisiana Saturday. I monitored the entire interaction through the compromised exterior surveillance cameras I hacked several months ago. A tired man, wearing a faded yellow polo shirt, trudged up the massive circular driveway, wiping copious amounts of sweat from his forehead. He did not look like an emissary of corporate destruction. He looked exactly like an underpaid, tired courier. He rang the brass doorbell and waited on the sprawling front porch. Richard opened the heavy oak doors, wearing his customary weekend attire, consisting of imported linen trousers and a monogrammed silk shirt. My father spent his entire adult life evaluating adversaries based purely upon their outward presentation. If a rival shipping executive arrived driving a luxury European sedan, Richard respected him immediately. If a competitor drove a standard domestic vehicle, Richard instantly dismissed him as an inconsequential peasant. This deeply ingrained inherent bias completely blinded him to the lethal nature of the unassuming courier standing on his pristine doorstep. Richard snatched the envelope from the server without uttering a single syllable of gratitude. He tore open the thin paper while walking back into the grand marble foyer. I switched my monitoring feed to the interior audio receptors scattered throughout their network of smart home devices. The hidden microphone located inside the crystal chandelier captured the precise moment he unfolded the default notice. A booming, arrogant laugh erupted from his chest, echoing loudly off the polished stone floors. He genuinely believed the document was a pathetic, amateurish bluff. He assumed I drafted the papers myself in a fit of powerless rage, playing at being a high-powered attorney to salvage my wounded pride. Jessica descended the sweeping mahogany staircase drawn by the loud sound of booming amusement. She peered over his broad shoulder, reading the harsh legal terms demanding immediate payment of the debt, now legally owned by Crescent Strategic Acquisitions. My sister lacked any foundational understanding of corporate law or basic economics. She spent her university years attending lavish sorority mixers while paying desperate classmates to complete her introductory assignments. When she read the stark demands printed on the flimsy paper, she joined our father in his loud chorus of mockery. She giggled uncontrollably, interpreting the cheap presentation as undeniable proof of my utter failure. In her warped reality, a genuine threat would have arrived via an armored vehicle, accompanied by severe men wearing tailored Italian suits. Vivian entered the foyer holding a heavy crystal vase filled with fresh white hydrangeas. My mother possessed a mind entirely consumed by visual aesthetics. For 3 consecutive decades, she meticulously curated the mansion to resemble a pristine center spread featured in an elite architectural magazine. She judged the worth of every object and every human being by their visual appeal and perceived social pedigree. When Richard handed her the legal notice, she wrinkled her nose in profound disgust. She did not bother to read the ironclad clauses detailing the 24-hour cure period. She did not comprehend the binding legal language outlining the immediate forfeiture of their tangible assets upon noncompliance. She merely observed the cheap typography and the absolute lack of proper letterhead. She complained bitterly that the ugly document clashed with her carefully designed interior decor. With a dramatic, theatrical sigh, she tossed the formal legal warning directly into the stainless steel kitchen trash receptacle. It landed unceremoniously beside discarded vegetable peelings and empty champagne bottles. They celebrated their false sense of security, pouring expensive imported mimosa cocktails to toast their imagined victory. They were entirely unaware that discarding that specific piece of paper constituted a fatal tactical blunder. Elite finance does not require glossy logos to execute a devastating checkmate. The document contained a rigid, meticulously calculated timeline. By intentionally ignoring the explicit 24-hour cure period, they voluntarily stepped directly over an invisible tripwire. They falsely assumed the lack of visual prestige equated to a total lack of enforcement capability. That vanity prevented them from recognizing the silent, heavy guillotine hovering directly above their exposed necks. The clock ticked down relentlessly. I spent the remainder of Saturday observing their blissful ignorance through the digital surveillance network. They hosted a small gathering of wealthy country club acquaintances that evening, serving imported caviar and boasting loudly about their upcoming maritime software acquisition. They spun elaborate fictional fables about Jessica negotiating a brilliant corporate deal, completely omitting the inconvenient fact that their dummy holding company was entirely bankrupt. Every single smile, every clinking glass, and every boastful anecdote only deepened the inescapable trench they were digging for themselves. I watched them dance blindly on the very edge of the precipice, reveling in the intoxicating illusion of their own supreme superiority. Sunday afternoon finally arrived, bringing the exact expiration minute of the legal grace period. Precisely at noon, the window of opportunity slammed shut forever. Their willful negligence triggered a severe multiplier penalty deeply embedded within the complex debt clauses I purchased from the Texas Lending Organization. This was not a standard simple late fee. It was a draconian, punitive corporate mechanism specifically designed to aggressively punish hostile noncompliance. The moment the digital clock struck 12, their total financial liability instantly doubled in magnitude. The staggering sum they owed transformed from a devastating burden into an inescapable astronomical catastrophe. Simultaneously, the expiration authorized my anonymous holding company to initiate immediate hostile seizure protocols regarding the physical residential property. I now possess the undisputed legal right to lock the iron gates and claim the entire structure. But the most immediate catastrophic consequence manifested rapidly within the digital banking realm. The uncorrected default automatically executed a sweeping injunction against every single liquid asset connected to their names. I watched my monitors closely as the automated banking requests flooded the Federal Reserve Network. The personal checking accounts belonging to Richard froze instantly. The illicitly funded credit lines utilized by Jessica locked permanently. The Gulf Coast Transit operational funds became instantly paralyzed, halting all commercial activity. The execution was absolute and undeniably instantaneous. I sat in my quiet apartment, sipping cool, purified water, while the automated financial algorithms completely drained their lifelines. The ultimate surprise arrived exactly 12 minutes later. I monitored a live transaction attempt originating from an upscale marina restaurant located on the scenic edge of Lake Pontchartrain. Richard had taken a group of potential private investors to a lavish Sunday brunch, hoping to secure supplementary capital to keep his sinking freight business afloat. The waiter presented the exorbitant bill resting on a silver tray. Richard confidently handed over his platinum corporate purchasing card, expecting the familiar approving nod. Instead, the electronic terminal flashed a bright crimson decline notification. He handed over a second card in mild frustration. Declined. A third card yielded the exact same humiliating result. The sophisticated, wealthy investors sitting across the linen-covered table watched in stunned, absolute silence as the regional shipping magnate failed to purchase a simple midday meal. The grand illusion of his untouchable wealth evaporated rapidly in a crowded public dining room, surrounded by the exact affluent peers he spent his entire life trying to impress. His mobile telephone began vibrating intensely, delivering a relentless barrage of automated text messages from multiple banking institutions, informing him that his entire existence was now the frozen property of a nameless corporate creditor. The true, unyielding nightmare had finally breached the tall, protective walls of his manufactured reality. The catastrophic reality of the frozen financial accounts struck the Baton Rouge estate with the devastating impact of a severe hurricane. Once the upscale marina restaurant declined his purchasing cards, the cascading failure accelerated exponentially. Every automated payment scheduled for that Sunday afternoon bounced violently against an impenetrable digital wall. The electricity provider issued an immediate suspension warning. The luxury automotive dealership dispatched a flatbed tow truck to reclaim the sports car from the circular driveway. The exclusive country club suspended her privileges due to a return draft. The invisible oxygen sustaining their lavish lifestyle vanished instantly, leaving them suffocating in an airless vacuum of total insolvency. By Monday morning, the psychological toll became physically apparent. Richard possessed no remaining digital avenues to launch an offensive. His logistics warehouse sat empty, with union drivers refusing to start their engines without verified payroll deposits. Bereft of his traditional leverage, my father reverted to a deeply ingrained coping mechanism. He retreated to his blue-collar origins. Long before he commanded a regional shipping empire, he worked as a grimy dockhand, loading heavy crates onto rusty barges. He demanded a mandatory family assembly at a gritty 24-hour diner located on the industrial outskirts of the city. He deliberately chose this greasy spoon, hoping the coarse working-class environment would somehow magically restore his dominant patriarchal persona. He believed, surrounded by scarred Formica tables and the smell of fried grease, he could regain his lost masculine authority. I arrived precisely at 10 in the morning, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer layered over a crisp white blouse. My attire projected absolute, unyielding corporate sovereignty. The heavy glass door chimed, announcing my entrance into the dimly lit establishment. The air hung thick with the heavy aroma of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon. I bypassed the scattered truck drivers and exhausted shift workers navigating toward the back corner of the restaurant. My toxic relatives sat huddled tightly together inside a cracked red vinyl booth. They resembled displaced refugees rather than proud members of Southern high society. Richard wore a rumpled flannel shirt, his unshaven face sagging under the immense gravity of his impending ruin. Vivian sat rigidly clutching her expensive designer handbag against her chest, as if it could shield her from the pervasive grime. Her meticulously styled hair appeared uncharacteristically flat. She stared at the sticky table surface with an expression of profound aristocratic revulsion. Jessica occupied the far corner of the booth, her eyes swollen and red from a long night of uninterrupted weeping. The Golden Child finally understood that her careless forgery possessed actual, terrifying consequences. I slid into the opposite side of the booth, folding my hands neatly over the scratched Formica. I did not order a beverage. I simply locked my gaze onto the broken patriarch sitting across from me. "We need your liquid capital," he rasped, his vocal cords vibrating with raw desperation. The commanding thunder that normally defined his speech was completely absent. He abandoned his towering pride, discarding decades of arrogance in a single breathless plea. He leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes pleading for salvation. "The Dallas Lending Syndicate sold our debt portfolio," he whispered, frantically glancing around the diner to ensure no one overheard his humiliating confession. "Some anonymous corporate entity operating out of Delaware bought the entire package. They accelerated every single clause. The lawyers sent a notice this morning. We are losing the mansion tomorrow. The new creditors are foreclosing on the property and liquidating the transit fleet. I need you to unlock your trust fund. We must buy the debt back from these invisible predators before they leave us homeless." He still believed I was a subordinate participant in his manufactured drama. He assumed blood loyalty would compel me to surrender my software algorithms to rescue his crumbling empire. He looked at me expecting the obedient daughter he bullied into submission at that country club retirement dinner just a few weeks prior. I reached smoothly into the right pocket of my charcoal blazer. My fingers wrapped around a cold, metallic object. I withdrew my hand and placed the item directly onto the sticky surface of the table. It was a heavy ring holding 2 solid brass keys. These were the exact same physical keys he demanded I surrender during his coordinated ambush. At that dinner, he insisted I hand over access to my downtown office and relinquish control of my autonomous life. He used these brass pieces of metal as a tangible symbol of his absolute authority. Now they represented something entirely different. I pressed my index finger against the metal ring and slid the keys slowly across the table until they rested directly in front of his coffee mug. "I am the anonymous corporate entity who purchased your distressed debt portfolio," I stated coldly, my voice slicing through the noisy ambient chatter of the diner. "Crescent Strategic Acquisitions is a holding company I established on Friday afternoon. I bought the forged promissory notes, I acquired the earnest money liabilities the Golden Child squandered, and I bought the cross-collateralized guarantee attached to your pristine residential estate." I tapped the brass keys with my manicured fingernail. "These pieces of metal no longer grant access to my downtown corporate servers," I explained, watching the comprehension dawn in his widening eyes. "These now unlock your front door. I am your sole creditor. I am your landlord." The visual transformation unfolding across their faces was remarkably cinematic. The remaining color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. He stared at the brass keys as if they were venomous serpents preparing to strike. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The realization hit him with the blunt force of a swinging anvil. He had spent the entire weekend raging against an invisible Delaware corporation, completely unaware that the architect of his destruction was the very daughter he discarded. Vivian gasped sharply, pressing her manicured hand over her mouth. Her facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The woman who valued social status above her own flesh and blood suddenly realized her beloved mansion now belonged entirely to the child she constantly belittled. She would never host another charity gala on that manicured lawn without my explicit permission. Jessica began to hyperventilate, clutching her throat as panic seized her respiratory system. The corporate clawback provisions she so arrogantly ignored were now being enforced by her estranged sister. She knew I possessed read-only access to her bank accounts. She knew I watched her spend the stolen syndicate funds on luxury car payments and designer clothes. There was no escape route available to her. "You tried to steal my life," I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathetic warmth. "You forged my signature to secure a fraudulent bridge loan. You intended to sacrifice my legitimate business to conceal your own massive failures. You believed you could execute a hostile takeover of my future because you viewed my intellect as your personal property. Your strategy failed spectacularly. Now we are going to finalize this negotiation under my specific, non-negotiable terms." I retrieved a thick manila folder from my leather briefcase and placed it beside the keys. "Inside this envelope are the final settlement contracts I announced," tapping the heavy paper. "You and your wife will immediately sign over the total remaining equity of the Baton Rouge estate to my trust. You will relinquish all legal claims to the property. You may continue to reside within the house, but you will do so strictly as my tenants. You will live on a rigidly monitored monthly financial allowance dispersed at my absolute discretion. If you violate any condition of this lease, you will be evicted within 24 hours. My mother let out a muffled sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. To become a dependent tenant inside her own castle was a psychological torture far worse than simple bankruptcy. I turned my intense focus toward the trembling figure cowering in the corner of the vinyl booth. "You have a separate legal document requiring your immediate attention," I commanded, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You will sign a comprehensive written confession detailing your exact role in the syndicate forgery. You will admit to executing federal wire fraud and squandering the earnest deposit. That confession will remain locked inside my secure vault. If you ever attempt to contact me or challenge this arrangement, I will hand that document directly to the district attorney. Furthermore, you are permanently banished from all remaining family assets. You will receive zero financial support from this day forward. You will find employment and pay your own debts." The diner seemed to grow completely silent around us, the clattering dishes and boisterous conversations fading into a muffled, distant hum. The sheer, absolute weight of my ultimatum crushed the remaining oxygen out of their lungs. They were completely cornered. The traps they set for me had snapped shut permanently around their own ankles. "Sign the settlement documents right now," I commanded, my voice echoing with final, undeniable authority. "Sign them, or I file the commercial foreclosure paperwork tomorrow morning." He stared at the cheap blue ink pen resting beside the manila folder. His hand hovered over the plastic barrel, shaking violently as he contemplated the complete annihilation of his legacy. He looked at his weeping wife, his terrified favorite child, and finally at the cold, impassive face of the daughter he underestimated his entire life. The patriarch reached out, grasping the pen, setting the stage for a final, desperate, unpredictable reaction that would shatter the remaining fragments of our broken bloodline. The blue plastic barrel of the cheap ink pen shook violently between Richard's thick, callous fingers. For 3 decades, this man utilized his imposing physical stature to bend the regional maritime shipping industry to his absolute will. He bullied union bosses, intimidated harbor masters, and commanded a sprawling logistics fleet through sheer volume and aggressive posturing. Now that terrifying patriarch was completely reduced to a hollow, trembling shell sitting inside a grimy industrial diner. He stared at the manila folder resting on the sticky formica surface. The documents inside represented the unconditional surrender of his entire manufactured kingdom. The psychological toll of his impending homelessness finally broke his stubborn resistance. He pressed the ballpoint tip against the signature line of the primary transfer agreement. The scratch of the metal rolling across the cheap paper sounded deafening over the ambient clatter of coffee cups and sizzling bacon grease. He executed the transfer with a jagged, illegible scrawl. By signing his name, he legally forfeited all remaining equity in the sprawling Baton Rouge estate, transferring the majestic property directly into the Maribel Brown Tech Security Trust. The grand illusion of his untouchable wealth evaporated into the humid morning air. Vivian sat beside him, her perfectly manicured hands tightly clutching a damp paper napkin. The high society matriarch who spent her entire existence cultivating an aura of elite country club prestige watched her social standing shatter into invisible dust. She no longer owned the pristine white columns or the expansive manicured gardens she utilized to judge her peers. She officially became a dependent tenant, surviving solely on the strict financial allowance I would dictate. The extravagant charity galas and imported champagne receptions were permanently canceled. Her new reality involved asking her estranged daughter for permission to repair a leaky faucet. I slid the executed property deed into my leather portfolio, securing the first phase of their comprehensive defeat. Next, I pushed the written confession across the table toward Jessica. The golden child was currently hyperventilating her face, stained with ruined makeup and sheer terror. She had spent her entire youth shielded from consequence. Whenever she failed a university course, crashed a luxury vehicle, or bankrupted a frivolous startup venture, our father always rushed in to absorb the damage. She fully expected this catastrophic syndicate forgery to follow the exact same established pattern. She believed signing this humiliating admission of guilt was the final, painful step before returning to her comfortable, pampered existence. She grasped the pen, her knuckles turning stark white under the fluorescent diner lights. She hastily scribbled her name at the bottom of the sworn affidavit documenting her precise role in the $250,000 commercial theft. She admitted to utilizing a dummy corporation, bypassing standard escrow procedures and rapidly liquidating the earnest money to satisfy her personal debts. Tears cascaded down her cheeks, splashing onto the freshly inked page. She pushed the paper back toward me, letting out a massive, ragged sigh of relief. In her naive mind, the ordeal was finally concluded. She assumed the debt was settled, the angry Texas lenders were banished, and the family could quietly sweep her monumental felony under the rug. I carefully placed her written confession into a separate protective sleeve. I secured the clasp on my briefcase, the sharp, metallic click, echoing with profound finality. Just as Jessica reached for a glass of ice water to soothe her raw throat, the heavy glass entrance doors of the restaurant swung open violently. The sudden influx of bright morning sunlight temporarily blinded the patrons seated near the front counter. Two imposing figures stepped across the threshold, entirely ignoring the hostess stand. They did not resemble the tired truck drivers or the exhausted shift workers occupying the adjacent booths. They wore crisp, dark windbreakers adorned with stark yellow lettering across the chest panels. Their posture radiated absolute, uncompromising authority. The federal agents navigated the narrow aisle, walking with deliberate, synchronized purpose directly toward our secluded corner booth. The ambient chatter inside the establishment died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Richard froze his coffee mug, hovering inches from his pale lips. Vivian gasped loudly, pressing herself deeply into the cracked vinyl seating. Jessica dropped her water glass. The heavy tumbler slammed onto the table, spilling ice and cold liquid across the formica surface. The lead agent stopped squarely beside our booth, his hardened gaze locking entirely onto my sister. He reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a leather credential wallet, displaying a gleaming silver badge. Jessica Brown, the agent, announced, his deep voice projecting across the quiet dining room. "You are placed under arrest for interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy regarding the illicit transfer of a $250,000 corporate holding deposit." A piercing, hysterical shriek erupted from Jessica. She scrambled backward, trapping herself against the restaurant window. Her wild, betrayed eyes darted frantically between the federal authorities and my cold, impassive face. She expected Richard to stand up and bellow at the men demanding they leave his precious daughter alone. But the patriarch remained firmly glued to his seat, paralyzed by the crushing realization that his localized Southern power held zero jurisdiction over the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He possessed no leverage here. He could not bribe a federal task force or intimidate a government mandate. "You said you would protect us," she sobbed uncontrollably, spittle flying from her lips as the second officer firmly grasped her trembling arms. "You promised to fix the debt. You took the house to make the syndicate go away." I remained perfectly still, watching the agent pull a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The ratcheting metallic click of the restraints locking tightly around her wrists sounded like industrial poetry. I stated I would protect the physical real estate asset from a commercial foreclosure. I corrected her, maintaining my clinical, detached cadence. I promised to neutralize the aggressive lending organization attempting to seize the property. I successfully fulfilled that specific financial obligation. I am now the sole proprietor of the family estate. I leaned slightly forward, ensuring she absorbed every single syllable of her doom. "However you chose to transfer fraudulent commercial documents across state lines to secure that initial bridge loan," I continued, "you accepted a massive wire transfer under false pretenses and rapidly liquidated the stolen funds using a corrupt shell corporation. That specific behavior violates federal banking statutes. That is a severe criminal mandate operating entirely beyond my personal jurisdiction. Elite finance can erase a civil debt, but it cannot erase a documented felony." The regional director of the Texas syndicate was a ruthless pragmatist. When I purchased the distressed debt portfolio from his organization for 80 cents on the dollar, he washed his hands of the civil liability. But he still harbored immense resentment regarding the blatant disrespect your forgery demonstrated. After the wire transfer cleared my anonymous holding company, he immediately forwarded the failed title audit, the forged promissory notes, and the banking transaction logs directly to the federal authorities. The syndicate did not need their money back anymore, but they still demanded aggressive retribution. "Please, Daddy," Jessica wailed, thrashing against the firm grip of the agents. "Do something! Do not let them take me away!" Richard slowly lowered his head, burying his face in his large, rough hands. A low, guttural sob tore through his chest. For the first time in his entire arrogant existence, he was completely, utterly helpless. He engineered a malicious trap designed to enslave my future, only to watch his beloved golden child walk willingly into a federal penitentiary. Vivian wept openly, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face, completely ignoring the staring patrons surrounding them. The officers hauled Jessica out of the booth, marching her toward the exit. Her hysterical screams echoed off the grease-stained walls, fading only when the heavy glass doors swung shut behind her. The flashing red and blue lights of the waiting transport vehicle illuminated the diner parking lot, casting long, erratic shadows across the table. I sat in the quiet aftermath, observing the absolute devastation of the two people who brought me into this world. They were broken, destitute, and entirely dependent on the mercy of the child they spent decades abusing. Their logistics business was paralyzed. Their mansion belonged to me. Their favorite daughter was currently sitting in the back of a government vehicle, facing a decade of mandatory minimum sentencing. I picked up my leather portfolio, sliding it smoothly under my arm. I stood up from the vinyl booth, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from my tailored charcoal blazer. I did not offer a comforting gesture or utter a single word of hollow sympathy. There was nothing left to negotiate. I walked down the central aisle of the diner, pushing through the exit doors and stepping into the warm Louisiana morning. The oppressive humidity felt surprisingly refreshing. The malignant dry rot that infected my family tree was finally excised, permanently severed from my life. The toxic elements were eliminated. My proprietary algorithms remained secure inside an impenetrable digital vault. My commercial empire was officially untouchable. I unlocked my vehicle, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the ruins of their favoritism burning quietly in my rearview mirror. The saga of the Brown family that we just traversed is not merely a tale of corporate espionage or a brilliant financial checkmate. It is a profound, devastating exploration of the modern family. At its core, this narrative serves as a harrowing cautionary tale about the catastrophic consequences of toxic parenting, the abandonment of fundamental values, and the heavy price of sacrificing emotional honesty for superficial prestige. In American culture, the traditional family structure has long been idealized as an unwavering sanctuary, a place where children are nurtured, guided, and meticulously prepared for the rigors of the adult world. However, there is a pervasive shadow side to this cultural ideal, the relentless pressure to project a flawless facade of generational success. The Brown family embodied this toxic pursuit. When the dust finally settled in that greasy Louisiana diner, the physical assets, the freight company, the software, the sprawling mansion, were revealed to be merely the collateral damage of a much deeper, rot-infested foundation. The true tragedy was a monumental failure in long-term parental guidance. Consider the ultimate fate of the golden child Jessica. From an external perspective, Richard and Vivian appeared to be providing her with the ultimate American dream. They granted her unfettered access to wealth, shielded her from the harsh realities of consequence, and erased her myriad mistakes with open checkbooks. But in their desperate, ego-driven attempt to protect her from the world, they actively disarmed her. Parenting is fundamentally about long-term guidance, and true guidance requires the uncomfortable enforcement of boundaries. When Richard pulled out a wad of cash to erase a shoplifting charge for a 12-year-old Jessica, he did not save his daughter. He condemned her. He taught her that fairness was a highly malleable concept, entirely dependent on who held the most capital and the loudest voice. He systematically stripped her of the opportunity to develop psychological resilience, personal accountability, and a functioning moral compass. By the time she reached adulthood, her emotional awareness was completely stunted, replaced by a dangerous, unchecked entitlement. She viewed the American economy not as a community requiring honest, diligent participation, but as a vast, bottomless reservoir of resources meant exclusively for her personal consumption. Her eventual arrest for federal wire fraud was not a sudden anomaly or a stroke of bad luck. It was the direct, cultivated harvest of her parents' profound failure to instill basic ethical boundaries. By shielding her from small failures, they guaranteed her ultimate destruction. On the exact opposite end of this toxic spectrum lies Maribel, the discarded scapegoat and the architect of the family's ruin. If Jessica represents the severe dangers of extreme enablement, Maribel represents the chilling, calculating consequences of emotional neglect and utility-based parenting. In a healthy traditional family, a child's worth is intrinsic. It is a given, never something to be earned through servitude. But Richard and Vivian viewed Maribel strictly through the lens of what she could provide for the family's bottom line. They routinely dismissed her introverted brilliance, undervalued her quiet discipline, and ultimately attempted to cannibalize her legitimate success to cover their own fraudulent blunders. What happens to a child who is raised without warmth, fairness, or emotional safety within their own home? They adapt. They learn to survive by building impenetrable fortresses, legal, financial, and emotional. Maribel's ultimate victory over the Texas lending syndicate and her own father is a masterclass in strategic brilliance, but it is also a profoundly sorrowful reflection of her upbringing. She executed her revenge with a clinical, detached precision that perfectly mirrored the very coldness her parents showed her. The family demanded a workhorse, and in doing so, they created a genius, but they completely extinguished her capacity for vulnerability and forgiveness. When parents fail to model empathy, they risk unleashing an emotional architect who will calculate their destruction down to the absolute last decimal point. Maribel did not destroy her family. She simply allowed the natural laws of consequence, which they had avoided for decades, to finally catch up to them. To raise children within a genuinely healthy family structure, we must actively reject the superficial metrics of success that often plague modern society. The sprawling Baton Rouge estate, with its pristine white columns and manicured azaleas, was nothing more than a rotting mausoleum of parental failure. True family responsibility is not found in the accumulation of wealth or the desperate maintenance of country club prestige. It is found in the quiet, consistent application of fundamental virtues, the necessity of radical honesty. A family must be anchored in truth, even when that truth is deeply uncomfortable. Sweeping debts, personal failures, and ethical misdeeds under the rug only breeds a culture of manipulation and paranoia. The unwavering pillar of fairness. Children possess an innate, razor-sharp sense of justice. When parents play favorites, they do not just fracture the sibling bond, they fracture the child's fundamental trust in the world. Fairness requires holding every child to the same high ethical standards, while simultaneously supporting their unique individual needs. The cultivation of emotional awareness. Success cannot merely be defined by corporate acquisitions, luxury vehicles, or social standing. Parents must teach their children to navigate their own internal emotions, to deeply understand the impact their actions have on others, and to recognize that true, lasting power lies in self-mastery, not in the domination of those around them. The ruins of the Brown family serve as a stark, undeniable reminder that the chickens always come home to roost. You simply cannot build a lasting legacy on a foundation of forged signatures, stolen earnest money, and emotional manipulation. Furthermore, you can never expect lifelong loyalty from a child you have actively betrayed to save your own ego. If you find yourself captivated by these intricate emotional explorations of justice, betrayal, and the hidden mechanics of human nature, I invite you to join our growing community. Please follow the channel Morning Revenge as we continue to dissect the dark, fascinating intersections of family drama, corporate warfare, and the psychology of ultimate payoffs. We explore the stories that remind us of the fragile line between success and total ruin. As the federal agents drive away and the morning sun illuminates the shattered illusions of the Baton Rouge estate, we are left to ponder the silent spaces in our own lives, the stories we tell our children, the consequences we bravely enforce, and the quiet examples we set in the shadows of our own homes. These are the true, lasting architects of the future. Look closely at the faces across your own dining table tonight. Are you raising a family anchored in grace, truth, and accountability? Or are you, without even realizing it, quietly forging the brass keys to your own eventual undoing?